Luke, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning. How's it going?
Good. We're very interested in what might come next and what you think might be possible. The first question I have is, speaking to somebody who knows a little bit about this recently, they said that if we all put masks on, our chances of getting more people to go to events would accelerate much quicker than it will do if we all continue to wander around with the masks half on or the masks not on at all.
They would. Masks are key, as we now know. I mean, loads of evidence suggests wearing masks is a great weapon, because first of all, it'll stop the spread of the virus is the absolute main thing, between from me to you and you to me, for instance. And anywhere crowds gather, you wear a mask. I mean, outdoors, of course, the risk is lower because obviously the wind will blow stuff away if there's a stadium outdoors or whatever. But there's no doubt masks will help. So people should really be wearing them at every opportunity.
And in terms of sports events, is it possible that we could have a full stadium at some point sooner rather than later if everybody in the stadium was to agree we're all going to wear masks?
Well, the first trick was let's get the viral count down, remember. I mean, Ireland's doing great at the moment. Our numbers are really low, If we get the viral count down to almost zero, if not zero, everything goes back to normal. The sports events happening in New Zealand, for instance, of course, it's a big challenge to achieve this, but we're heading in the right direction, is the first thing to say. The zero COVID policy, this is called, for instance. But then secondly, wearing masks will help for definite. You still need to maintain some social distancing. There's a big experiment happening in Germany at the moment with a crowd of 4,000 people, if you can believe it. And they're measuring them and how much they contact each other, and they're using special dyes if they touch, various things to see how feasible it is to get a crowd together. So we may get some more data from that kind of event to see what the best practice would be.
What's your instinct on that in terms of what's going to come next? So we have another deadline coming at the start of August, which we expect the number of people who are going to be allowed to go to stadiums will go from 200 to 500. Is there any wiggle room around that? Is there a potential that we might have a percentage capacity as opposed to a flat number? What's coming next?
Yeah, again, it's all about indoors and outdoors, first of all. Outdoors will be more lax, I guess, and you see bigger crowds gather outdoors eventually, Indoors is much more challenging, obviously, because the virus can then circulate much more effectively, So I think the current guidelines are sensible. Let's just stick with them and see what happens, I guess. You see, the worry would be counts will start to go up again and it'll be precipitous in some way, and that means the schools are threatened. That's the big worry we have, you see, that if counts climb, that means the schools are now may potentially in trouble, So the real goal is to keep the numbers down as low as possible.
That's a kind of interesting that this isn't just a single part of a jigsaw. So, we've seen a lot of calls from people in the GAA saying 200 at a ground like the Gaelic grounds is ridiculous. But actually, 200 at the Gaelic grounds right now and for the next month might mean that the schools can go back, and then we have another piece of the jigsaw that fits in. So there's no room for exceptionalism here.
No, there's not. I mean, we're doing a great job as a country. We're all in behind this, aren't we? And we're getting very close to elimination, remember, which is fantastic news altogether. Anywhere you're risking spread, a big crowd gathering, crowds mixing, especially indoors, as I say, not observing the guidelines basically increases the threat of the thing coming back, you see. So that's the big worry we have.
The 200 to 500 thing is still kind of being obsessed about in sporting terms at the moment. And Owen made the point a little bit earlier on. So we're watching Premier League games and we're watching stuff from most of the rest of the world, with the exception really of New Zealand, where they have done an amazing job. We're going to be one of the first places where you actually do have people at stadiums. Again, would you have any concerns about us going from 200 to 500 outdoors in 3 weeks' time? Or actually, do you think now is not the time for that? Wait until the schools are back and then see what happens?
Well, again, it's about the numbers. If the numbers are good, you can begin to think about those sorts of crowds again, So I think it's a week-by-week basis. I'll tell you one thing. If we begin to see a spike in 2 or 3 places around the country, you can forget it, because then it's too much of a risk then that it'll start to spread again, So it really is kind of a week-by-week thing. And again, with the numbers that we have at the moment would justify those kinds of numbers, I guess. But it's something to watch very closely.
You had Jerry Killeen coming out a few weeks ago, I think at the start of June, saying it'll be 4 years before we see full capacity at Irish sports events again, which obviously is putting a fairly firm timeline on things, but it's also a fairly extraordinary timeline if you're looking for precise numbers. Have you considered that at all? What the number of years would be before you have a full capacity at an Irish sports event? And I presume this is all taken into the idea that you go back to normal, where you don't wear a mask or something like that.
Yeah, again, it depends on a vaccine, doesn't it, in so many ways? It's very hard to put a precise number on these things. But if we get a vaccine for this virus, we can then begin to think about absolutely going back to normal much more quickly than that. I mean, if there's a vaccine available, say, early next year, it ramps up slowly, then into the whole population. Then you can begin thinking back to normal the way we were, you see. The second, I mean, Jerry started talking about it, there's no vaccine really, you know, and then it's like a long haul, you know, to get to that point. It might even take that long to get to a vaccine. So there's uncertainties here. We've got to keep our fingers crossed that one of two things happen. We suppress the virus ourselves way down, a bit like New Zealand, if you like. And of course, the concern there is the usual things about travel and so on. And secondly, then the science gives us a solution. And the solution will be a vaccine, hopefully. And again, that's going full pelt. Remember, there's 4 vaccines now going into phase 3 trial.
Oh, just a little bit of frozen there from Professor Luke O'Neill, immunologist and professor of biochemistry at Trinity College, Dublin. I think we might just have Professor Luke O'Neill back. Yeah, you were just saying...
I'm back.
Yeah, there's 4 vaccines going into phase 3. Is that right? Yeah.
That's right. It is 4 are in phase 3. There's over 165 in development. 27 are now going through this phase 2 process. So all these vaccines are kind of in line, I suppose, you know. And yesterday, actually, one of them called the Moderna vaccine, that's begun the phase 3 trial. That's a 30,000 patient trial, if you can believe it. Now, again, fingers firmly crossed, because as I say, the way out of this is a vaccine for definite. If we don't get a vaccine quickly, the second option is therapies in hospital to stop people dying and getting sick. There's hope there as well. So that's our second line of attack, really. So there's many things happening at the moment out there to try and beat this virus. And like Tony Fauci, the great Tony Fauci, uses the phrase cautiously optimistic. And did you see, guys, his baseball card was the biggest selling baseball card ever? Did you see that?
No, I didn't. Right.
He threw the first pitch, you know, at the first MLB game, you know. It was the Washington Nationals, are his team, threw the first pitch in. They got a photograph of him. It's the best-selling baseball card ever. He was amazed himself. If Yogi Berra was watching, he must be devastated. He said, you know, a scientist has the biggest-selling baseball card. But Fauci himself has said he's cautiously optimistic, which is a really good thing to hear, isn't it?
Luke, could I ask what do you think is the biggest danger about attending a sports event right now? Is it sitting at your seat, being in relatively close proximity with other individuals? Is it going through the turnstiles? Is it milling around, going to the bathroom in the stadium? What is the biggest danger for you about the matchday experience?
It's close contact by far. So if you're with someone in close contact for more than 15 minutes, that's a high risk activity. Let's put it that way, right? Secondly, of course, if the more and more people densely packed in, the more chance there is of that happening. And if there isn't good air circulation, if the air stagnates, then the virus can sort of linger a bit, you know. And then the other one is shouting, sadly. I mean, shouting we know is a big risk factor here. The virus comes out of your mouth when you shout, even more than when you speak, you see. So if a football crowd is shouting its head off, you're going to predict more virus being released in that way. Now, again, you mitigate against those by wearing a mask, because if that'll trap the virus, you see. Secondly, a bit of spacing, as I said. The gig in Germany, it's 4,000 people. They're testing 1.5 meters as a space there. Will that work with a crowd at a rock concert, you know? So, but it is all about close contact, really. The bit of, say, going to the toilet and touching things, there's less of a risk there. There's still a risk you might put your hand on something where a virus has been, or someone's coughed onto a surface, say. They're called touch points in the business, by the way. There will be a certain number of touch points in a football stadium. You got to limit those as well. And the hand washing, of course, mitigates against that. So there are things people can do to lower the risk of these things. But by far and away, it's close proximity for a prolonged time is the biggest risk factor.
You mentioned baseball there. The Miami Marlins, obviously, Florida has been a centre. It's been absolutely rampant over the last while. The Miami Marlins have an outbreak, and so their team has been shut down, and the next couple of fixtures that they have has been shut down. That's one of the concerns, really, I guess, that we might get stuff under control, but then obviously people from other countries are going to come and go, and that level of normality, I suppose, is something that is utterly dependent on a vaccine. And if the vaccine is going to be slow, what can we do in the meantime to mitigate that? Is there an element of this where we're going to have to say, all of our life we're going to be wearing masks when we're meeting people from now on? Like, is that a possibility into the future?
Well, again, if we can just get the virus right down, and that means careful monitoring and testing and tracing. New Zealand is the ideal. They don't wear masks anymore in New Zealand. All the pubs are open. All the gigs are happening. Sporting events are happening, you know. So the ultimate goal is to try and eliminate. You can do that through, you know, judicious test, trace, aggressive test, trace, isolate, aggressive lockdown of a country, for instance. There's even talk of several countries locking down again together if this continues into the future, you know. So there's various things in mind here that might be that will help us if there is a situation where the virus is still there, you see. So in other words, we're not powerless against this. There are various things we can do. If you're outdoors, a big crowd can gather if it's suitably distanced to watch a sporting event, because again, the outdoors is low risk, you know. So again, I guess we might re-examine the numbers eventually and the risks associated with specific numbers. But in other words, I think my view would be there's great progress happening here to try and beat this virus. It will take a bit longer, though. It's not going to happen overnight, you know. And as I say, the worst thing is if there were, like that you're dead right. The Miami Marlins, there was players and coaches tested positive. They were living in a bubble, remember, and they thought they were, you know, bulletproof, but yet there was an outbreak in that group of people and they had to cancel these games. So it's a very contagious virus. So sadly, we got to be very cautious coming into the next few months, really.
So at the moment, again, a lot of pressure coming on the government to ramp things up with regards to local community GAA, and you know that obviously doesn't just apply to GAA, it applies to local rugby, it applies to, and there might be different scenarios where some sports might not actually have the same facilities that GAA grounds have, or rugby grounds have, or soccer grounds have. What's if you're advising them, what would your advice be?
Yeah, again, it's the same thing again, I suppose, in many ways. I mean, one thing they're talking about, Joe, is that the different sports in America might have different standards in a way, you know. So baseball is not the worst because it's not a full contact sport, you know. So therefore, you can be slightly looser with baseball than you can, say, with a contact sport. They're looking at that and having slightly different rules in the US anyway. In terms of crowd size, as we're saying, sadly, we've got to avoid the big crowds at the moment, at least huge numbers, certainly in confined spaces with overpopulation, if you like, is this close contact. It's a bit obvious in a way, because obviously the virus loves crowds. It loves shouting, you know, it loves spreading in that way. So if we were to go back to normal, this virus would rub its hands with glee almost. I'm going to spread again here, you know. So it's a tough one really to try to mitigate against these things.
What was your reaction last week when you saw Leeds United and Liverpool fans out in the streets celebrating their respective teams' successes?
To quote our friend Tony Hoolan, I was beyond nervous. Wasn't that his phrase? Because the chance of things spreading there is high, isn't it? And that's a worry we all have, not just in that context. Any crowds of people gathering in that way. Alcohol is a big factor because it lowers your capacity for risk. You take more risks if you have a few drinks. That means you break some of the guidelines, you know, and lots of evidence for this, of course. Alcohol and social distancing. So when I saw those images, I went, oh God, that doesn't look great to me, you know, because remember, it's so contagious. A single case can spread through a community. You know, you can go, remember, it went from 1 case to 14 million, for crying out loud. You know, started with one person in China. So it can spread very rapidly. That kind of crowd loves that sort of setting. So that was a definite concern.
So that's probably worth bearing in mind for all those people who are arguing that we need to have different standards for different grounds and percentages and all that kind of stuff. It's like, if we all just calm down for a couple of weeks and then reassess.
Keep the ship steady. We've got the virus on the run, basically, at this stage in Ireland. Now, we can't let up. I mean, the numbers are good. There's a risk it might come back. And again, our acting CMO has said this last night. Keep doing what we're doing. Keep washing your hands. Keep wearing a mask. Try and stay away from people, sadly. Try to observe a bit of this. Stay outdoors. Really key things. And then we'll see the numbers go down even more. It's within our power to do these things, really.
One last point on that, because there are definitely people within communities arguing that from a mental health perspective, the gatherings are important, and it's good to feel that sense of community again. It's been a long time since people have felt that. So we need to get that balance between keeping people happy and safe and also keeping people happy and safe on the other side.
We do indeed. And one more sporting fact, guys. It was a great study showing the home advantage has gone away when there's no crowds. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
That's a fascination, isn't it? So there's an example. So your team might not do as well if without a crowd supporting you in a way, you know. But you're absolutely right. We need to get back to the way we were as much as possible because sport is so important to people. And it's a fantastic event, isn't it, for communities and all sorts. So, but again, it's a bit like the schools in a way. If we keep it steady, try and keep the counts down, get them right down, then you can begin to think about in the next few months, you see, beginning to think about returning back to normal.
Because the repercussions of everybody rushing out into being crowds are that the virus can make a comeback, and that would be catastrophic for human life and for our economy.
Well, we go back to square one in a way. The school, imagine if we open the schools in September and they close again. That'd be a huge tragedy. You know, now if there are outbreaks in schools, there might be localized shutdown. That's happened in Israel and in Melbourne, for instance. Initially, all of Melbourne shut down. Then you may have seen that as well. So, but initially they might do one area locking down. But still, we don't want that, do we? Can you imagine if we reopen schools and then certain schools around Dublin or whatever have to close again? That'd be a nightmare, you know. So again, we just got to keep this steady to try and avoid those things happening.
All right. Good sound advice. Professor Luke O'Neill, thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Great. Thanks, Ryan.
Professor Luke O'Neill is an immunologist and professor of biochemistry at Trinity College Dublin and has been a consistent voice of sanity and reason throughout this entire crisis, somebody that we've turned to at various stages here. And just interesting, Owen, that's, look, cool the jets. We're nearly there. That's the most important message from that.
Literally cool the jets as well. If you're prone to bouts of anger on the sideline, prone to bouts of volume, shouting at people, don't go to sport.